The first thing folks noticed when he rode back into town was the dust. It clung to him like years he couldn't wash away, rising behind his horse in a long, tired trail that stretched clear to the edge of the horizon. Some said they recognized the way he sat in the saddle, steady and quiet, like a man who had seen too much and learned to speak less. Others swore it couldn't be him, not after all this time. But deep down, the town remembered. And so did she. Back when the world was smaller and days felt longer, they were just two barefoot kids running through fields that didn't belong to them, laughing like nothing could ever pull them apart. They built their own little world beside the creek, where the water ran clear and cold, and promises felt as strong as iron. He used to carve her tiny wooden trinkets with a pocket knife too big for his hands, and she kept every single one like treasure. She would tell him he'd leave one day, that boys like him always did, and he would shake his head, grin wide, and swear he'd come back for her. They were 10 the summer everything changed. No one talked much about that day. Just that his family packed up before sunrise, their wagon creaking under the weight of everything they owned. The town barely stirred as they left, like it didn't want to admit it was losing one of its own. She had run all the way to the edge of the dirt road, her breath sharp in her chest, just in time to see him climb up beside his father. He didn't look back at first. Maybe he couldn't, but when he finally did, their eyes met across the distance, and he lifted his hand in a silent promise. He would come back. Years passed, slow at first, then all at once. The creek dried thinner each summer, and the fields didn't feel quite as wide. She grew into herself the way the land did, strong and steady, carrying more than she ever let on. Suitors came and went, drawn by her quiet beauty and the way she held her ground. But she never gave them more than a polite smile. People said she was waiting for something. Some said it was foolish. Others said it was faith. She never answered. And now he was back. The town had changed, though it tried not to show it. New buildings stood where old ones once leaned, and faces had grown older, lined with time and hard work. But the air still carried that same dry heat, and the wind still whispered through the wooden boards like it always had. When he rode down the main street, every eye followed him. Not just because of who he might be, but because of what his return could mean. He wasn't the boy who left, that much was clear. His shoulders were broader, his face marked by sun and miles traveled. There was something guarded in his eyes, something that spoke of roads that didn't lead home easily. But beneath it all, there was still that same quiet steadiness. The same promise, buried deep. She saw him before he saw her. Standing just outside the general store, her hand froze mid-motion as the sound of hoofbeats reached her. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. She turned slowly, her heart already knowing what her eyes were about to confirm. And there he was, just as the story said he might return, only real, only closer than she had ever dared to imagine again. Their eyes met, just like they had all those years ago on that dusty road. Only this time, neither of them looked away. But promises made by children don't always survive the weight of time. And as he swung down from his horse, taking his first step toward her, there was something else in his expression. Something uncertain, something unspoken. Because coming back was one thing. Keeping the promise was another. He stopped a few steps away from her, close enough to see the faint freckles across her nose, close enough to notice how her hand tightened slightly at her side. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The town carried on around them in low murmurs, boots against wood, a wagon creaking somewhere down the road. But it all felt distant, like it belonged to another place. "You came back," she said finally, her voice steady, though her eyes searched his face like they were trying to find something familiar in all the years that had passed. "I said I would," he answered. It sounded simple, almost too simple for something that had taken so long. She gave a small nod, but there was a question in it when she didn't speak out loud. He could see it clear as day. Why now, after all these years? Why now? Before either of them could say more, the door of the general store swung open behind her, and the shopkeeper stepped out, wiping his hands on a cloth. His eyes flicked between them, narrowing slightly as recognition settled in. "Well, I'll be," the old man muttered. "Didn't think we'd see you ride back into this town." The cowboy tipped his hat politely. "Didn't think I would either. There was something in the way he said it that made the shopkeeper pause, like he wanted to ask more but thought better of it. Instead, he gave a slow nod and stepped aside, though his gaze lingered a moment longer than necessary. She noticed it too. "You should come by the creek," she said quietly, turning her attention back to him. "It's still there." "Not the same, but it's there." A faint smile touched his lips, the first real one since he arrived. "Figured it might be. I'll be there at sundown," she added, almost like she was testing him. He nodded once. "I'll come." She didn't wait for anything else. She turned and walked away, her steps calm, but just a little too quick, like staying any longer might have been harder than she let on. He watched her go until she disappeared around the corner, then let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The town wasn't as quiet once she was gone. Whispers started low, spreading from one porch to another, from one doorway to the next. Folks remembered things, not just about him, but about his family. About the trouble that had followed them even back then. Some said his father had enemies. Others said it was something worse, something that never quite made it into words. And now he was back, riding in like the past hadn't been left behind for a reason. He led his horse toward the edge of town, where the buildings gave way to open land. The air felt different there, less crowded, though it carried its own weight. He tied the reins loosely and stood for a while, looking out across the fields that once felt endless. Memories came easy, but they didn't come light. He remembered the night before they left. The hushed voices, the tension in his father's face, the way his mother packed in silence. He had asked what was wrong, but no one gave him an answer. Just that they were leaving and they wouldn't be coming back. Not then, but things had a way of catching up. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small, worn object wrapped in cloth. Carefully he unfolded it, revealing a tiny wooden carving, rough around the edges but still holding its shape. A little horse, carved by a boy who didn't know much about the world except that he wanted to leave something behind. He turned it over in his hand, his jaw tightening slightly. There were things he hadn't told her. Things he couldn't, not yet. Back in town, she hadn't gone far. Instead of heading home, she lingered just out of sight, her back pressed lightly against the wall of a nearby building. She closed her eyes for a moment, steadying herself. Seeing him again wasn't how she imagined it would feel. She had held on to that promise for so long, through seasons that tested her patience and years that tried to change her mind. But standing in front of him now, she realized something she hadn't expected. He was a stranger in ways that mattered. And yet somehow not entirely. A shadow fell across the ground near her, pulling her from her thoughts. She opened her eyes to see a tall figure standing at the edge of the alley, watching her. "You shouldn't get too close to him," the man said, his voice low and firm. Her expression hardened slightly. "That's none of your concern." The man took a step forward, his boots scraping softly against the dirt. "It will be when trouble follows him here." "And it will." She held his gaze, refusing to back down. "You don't know that." He let out a short breath, something close to a humorless laugh. "I know his kind, and I know what rides behind them." Her heart sank just a little, though she didn't let it show. Because deep down she had seen it too. That look in his eyes, like he hadn't just come back to keep a promise. Like he had brought something with him. By the time the sun began to dip toward the horizon, the whole town felt different. The light turned soft and golden, stretching shadows across the dirt road, but beneath that calm glow, something restless moved through the air. Doors closed a little earlier. Conversations lowered when someone passed by. It was the kind of quiet that came before trouble, even if no one said it out loud. He made his way toward the creek, just as the last bit of daylight clung to the sky. The path was worn but familiar, each step pulling him deeper into memories he had tried to outrun. The sound of water reached him first, softer than he remembered, like time had taken something from it. When he finally stepped through the trees, he saw her standing near the edge, looking down at the slow-moving current. For a moment he didn't speak. He just watched her, trying to match the woman in front of him with the girl he had left behind. There were pieces of her that hadn't changed at all, and others that told a story he hadn't been there to witness. "You came," she said without turning. "I told you I would." She let out a quiet breath, almost like she expected that answer but still needed to hear it. When she finally faced him, her expression was softer than it had been in town, but there was still something guarded in her eyes. "You always said that," she replied, "even when we were kids. You said a lot of things back then." He stepped closer, stopping just a few feet away. "I meant them?" She studied him for a long moment. "Then tell me why it took you so long." The question hung between them, heavier than anything else she could have asked. He looked away briefly, his gaze settling on the water as it moved past, steady and unchanging. "It wasn't as simple as leaving and coming back," he said slowly. "It never is," she answered. "But people still do it." He nodded, like he knew she had every right to say that. "There were things my father got mixed up in before we left. Debts, disputes. The kind that don't just disappear because you move on." Her brow tightened slightly. "So you stayed away because of that?" "At first," he admitted. "Then it became something else." She took a small step closer. "What does that mean?" He hesitated, and that pause told her more than his words ever could. "It means I had to make sure it wouldn't follow me back here," he said finally. She folded her arms lightly, not in anger, but in thought. "And you're sure it won't?" He didn't answer right away. Back in town, the man who had warned her earlier stood near the saloon porch, watching the road that led out west. Two other men lingered nearby, speaking in low voices. They weren't from around here, that much was clear. Their clothes were travel-worn, their faces set in a way that suggested they were looking for something, or someone. "You said he rode in this morning?" one of them muttered. The man nodded. "Didn't try to hide it either." The second stranger glanced toward the fading light. "That's either brave or foolish, maybe both," the first replied. The man on the porch didn't join in, but his jaw tightened slightly. He had seen enough in his life to recognize patterns, and this one didn't sit right with him. Trouble didn't just appear without reason. It followed trails, left marks, and waited for the right moment. And now it felt close. At the creek, she stepped past him, moving closer to the water. "Someone spoke to me today," she said quietly. His attention snapped back to her. "Who?" "A man who thinks he knows you," she replied. "Or at least the kind of life you've been living." His expression darkened slightly. "And what did he say?" "That you didn't come back alone," she said, turning to face him again. "That something followed you here." The words settled heavily between them. He ran a hand over the back of his neck, his gaze drifting toward the trees, like he was measuring the distance between where they stood and everything beyond it. "I tried to keep it away from here," he said. "Tried," she repeated. Before he could respond, a distant sound broke through the quiet. It was faint, but unmistakable. The rhythm of hooves against hard ground, more than one moving fast. Both of them turned toward the direction of the road. Her heart began to race, though she didn't fully understand why. His expression, however, told a different story, because he knew that sound. And he knew it wasn't passing through. The sound of hooves grew louder, steady and fast, cutting through the quiet like a warning no one could ignore. The cowboy's posture shifted at once, every bit of ease gone from his stance. His eyes fixed on the narrow path leading back toward town, his jaw set tight. "They found me sooner than I thought," he said under his breath. She stepped closer to him, her voice low but firm. "Who are they?" "Men who don't forget," he replied. "Men who believe debts are paid one way or another." Her chest tightened at his words, but she didn't step back. "Then running didn't end it." "No," he said. "It only delayed it." The hoofbeats were close now, echoing across the land, stirring dust along the road. Without another word, he reached for his horse's reins and began leading it away from the creek. "We need to move," he said. She didn't hesitate. "Where?" "Somewhere open," he answered. "I won't let this reach the town." That struck her. "You think they'd bring trouble into people's homes?" He glanced at her, something sharp in his eyes. "If they think it'll force my hand, they won't think twice." The weight of that settled quickly. This wasn't just about him anymore. It never had been. They moved fast, keeping to the edge of the fields where the tall grass offered some cover. The last light of day faded into a dusky blue, and the air cooled, but the tension only grew heavier. Every sound felt louder, every shadow deeper. Behind them, the riders entered the town. A few lanterns flickered on as people stepped out onto their porches, drawn by the noise. The strangers didn't slow down, their horses pushing forward with purpose. The man from the saloon porch watched them closely, his suspicion confirmed without a word needing to be said. One of the riders scanned the street, his gaze sharp. He was seen here. He won't stay in one place, another replied. Men like him always look for an escape, or something worth staying for, the first said, his eyes narrowing slightly. The man on the porch stepped forward, then, his voice steady. You won't find much by tearing through this town. The riders turned their attention to him. There was a brief silence, the kind that stretched just enough to carry meaning. We're not here for the town, one of them said. Just the man who rode in this morning, the porchman held his ground. Then you'd best keep it that way. Out beyond the edge of town, she and the cowboy reached a stretch of open land that sloped gently upward. From there, the view stretched wide, giving them a clear look back toward the road. He finally stopped, tying his horse to a low branch before turning his full attention to her. You shouldn't be here, he said. Her eyes flashed, not with fear, but with something stronger. You don't get to decide that for me. This isn't what I wanted for you, he insisted. And leaving without a word was? She shot back. The question hit harder than anything else that night. He looked at her, really looked this time, and whatever answer he had didn't come easy. I thought staying away would keep you safe, he said. And now? She asked. He glanced back toward the distant lights of the town, then toward the dark stretch of land behind them. Now, I'm not so sure of anything except this isn't over. She stepped closer, her voice softer but no less certain. Then stop trying to carry it alone. Before he could respond, the riders appeared at the far edge of the field, their silhouettes dark against the fading light. They had tracked him faster than expected. There, one of them called out, pointing. The moment snapped tight. The cowboy moved slightly in front of her without thinking, placing himself between her and the approaching men. His hand rested near his side, not out of fear, but readiness. The riders slowed as they drew closer, forming a loose line. There was no rush in their movement now, just confidence. You've been hard to catch, one of them said, his voice carrying across the distance. I wasn't hiding, the cowboy replied. No, the man agreed. You came back? A faint wind stirred the grass around them, the only movement in an otherwise still moment. This ends tonight, the rider added. The cowboy didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced briefly over his shoulder at her. There was something unspoken in that look, something that carried years of distance and one promise that still hadn't been settled. Then he faced forward again. Yeah, he said quietly. It does. The space between them felt charged, like the land itself was holding its breath. Every second stretched longer than the last, the tension rising to a breaking point. Because whatever happened next would decide more than just his fate. It would decide whether the past finally let go or pulled everything down with it. For a long moment no one moved. The wind brushed through the tall grass, carrying the last warmth of the day into the cooling night. The cowboy stood firm, his gaze steady on the men in front of him, while she remained just behind him, close enough to feel the tension in his shoulders. One of the riders stepped forward slightly, not in a rush but with purpose. You know why we're here, he said. The cowboy nodded once. Yeah, I do. Then you also know we didn't ride all this way for nothing. I figured that too. There was no anger in his voice, just a quiet acceptance. He reached slowly into his coat, careful with every movement. The men tensed, their attention sharpening, but he pulled out nothing more than a folded piece of paper and a small leather pouch. This is what my father owed, he said, holding them out where they could be seen. Took me years to gather it. Every job, every mile, it all led to this. The rider narrowed his eyes. You expect us to believe that settles it? It should, the cowboy replied, because the debt was never mine to begin with. But I carried it anyway. The words hung heavy in the air. The men exchanged brief looks, weighing more than just the pouch in his hand. They had expected a chase, maybe even a fight. Not this. The rider who seemed to lead them stepped closer, his boots pressing into the dry earth. He took the pouch, opening it just enough to see what was inside. His expression didn't change much, but something in his stance shifted. And the paper? He asked. Proof, the cowboy said. Signed and marked. That the account is closed, once and for all. The man unfolded it slowly, scanning the worn ink. The silence stretched again, but this time it felt different. less like a storm about to break and more like one passing by. Finally, the rider let out a breath. You went a long way to fix something that wasn't your doing. The cowboy gave a faint nod. Some things follow you whether you ask for them or not. The man studied him for another second, then folded the paper back up. Seems you've done enough. Relief didn't come all at once. It settled slowly, like the land after a long dry season finally meeting rain. The other riders eased back, their grip on the moment loosening. We're done here, the lead rider said, turning his horse slightly. No reason for this to go any further. Just like that, the tension that had built for years began to fade. The cowboy didn't move right away. He watched as the riders turned and headed back the way they came, their figures growing smaller against the darkening horizon. Only when they were nearly out of sight did he let out a breath he had been holding for far too long. Behind him, she stepped forward. "That's it?" she asked softly. He turned to her, and for the first time since he had returned, there was no weight in his eyes. "That's it." She searched his face as if making sure it was real this time. "So the past is finally done with you." He shook his head slightly. "Not done, just settled." A small smile touched her lips. "I think that's as close as it gets." They stood there for a moment, the quiet no longer heavy, but calm. The kind of calm that comes after something hard has been faced and carried through. "You really kept your promise," she said. "I told you I would come back," he replied. She looked down briefly, then back up at him. "You did more than that." He stepped a little closer, not rushing, giving her time to meet him halfway if she chose to. "I didn't just come back for a promise," he said. "I came back for you." Her breath caught slightly, but she didn't look away this time. "Took you long enough," he smiled, a real one now. "Yeah, it did." Back in town, the night had settled in fully, but the unease from earlier had lifted. A few lanterns still glowed, and quiet conversations carried through open windows. Word would spread by morning, as it always did, but this time it would bring relief instead of worry. Out in the field, under a sky beginning to fill with stars, they stood side by side. The years between them hadn't disappeared, but they no longer felt like something standing in the way. "Will you stay?" she asked. He looked out across the land, then back at her. "If you'll have me." She didn't answer with words right away. Instead, she reached for his hand, holding it like she had all those years ago, only stronger now, certain in a way that childhood never could be. "I was never waiting for you to be perfect," she said quietly. "I was waiting for you to come home, and this time he had." The cowboy who left as a boy had returned as a man, carrying the weight of the past and finally setting it down. The promise made beside a quiet creek had found its way through time, through distance, through doubt. And in the end, it led him right back to where he was always meant to be.